everyone's expecting this to continue for what we've seen. Okay. We also have changes, so it's not just about what we're buying and where we're buying, it's also how we're paying. And you know, the number of transactions now through the mobile device is now, according to these numbers as well, you've got again half of the people who are using a mobile app in the past week. So the amount of cash that people are using with this situation is of course down, and the number of electronic transactions has actually gone up significantly. So the prompt pay numbers, just to have a look at those year on year, so prior COVID versus through the COVID period, has gone from 9.6 million transactions per day to 15.6. So that's a big number now that are now transactions that are electronic as opposed to cash. And that's a big change and a fundamental change for the financial industry, which again, they will say that this is what the norm will be moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go to. On the media side, so of course we've seen changes around this as well. And I'm not sure if your phones have changed. Mine certainly have. This is just an example of it, but you know, prior to COVID, we probably had our apps for transportation, and we had maybe some travel apps, and of course we'll have our standard apps of Line and Facebook and also Google on there. But now it's ultimately changed. Travel apps have dropped, and Zoom, TikTok. We've also got our e-commerce also up there, and they've changed. They've changed the way in which we use them, and also the amount of time that we're using. So from a media level, the media environment is all changed. Here's an example of it from prior COVID to the COVID period. Of course, the major apps didn't change dramatically. It's just, again, the frequency in which they've been used. But everyone would have the Facebook, YouTube, you'd have a Line on there for sure. And then you'd have a sprinkling of different types of apps that you use. So whether that's shopping related, whether it's banking related, and which particular bank. But down the bottom, I also showed this because the amount of games that are being downloaded and the number of course, Zoom downloads or Google Meets have all increased significantly over this COVID situation. Okay, so it's changed, and it's changed a lot of the way in which we're looking at it. So this is just an example from my hometown. I haven't lived there for a number of years. In fact, I've lived in Thailand for 13 years and Singapore for 6 before that. So this is an example of Sydney Harbour, and before I used to go back maybe every 1 or 2 years to go back to Sydney. But these days, more and more people are looking and wishing perhaps, or even just looking at ways in which they can, or places in which they can see, and even at this point dream of going to a different location to see. But it's not going to be a physical trip at the moment. It's all done through our devices in which we're connecting with, and that's the reality of the world in which we live in. Okay. These are also changes that occurred over the COVID period, and of course, these are things that did happen. Home cooking, of course, went up dramatically, and everyone started trying new recipes out, or baking cakes, or different types of things, and that went up. And same with DIY, so people were planting things in their gardens or doing some home renovations in some way. And even when also the lockdowns started to dissipate, we also started to take on new activities, and skateboarding's been a big one here in Thailand, which has certainly taken off. My question to you, so some people can take their mutes off now if they don't mind. Do you think these home cooking and DIY and skateboarding, do you think it's going to last, or do you think people will go back to normal activities around these? What do people think? Anyone want to take a guess? Have people stopped doing them? Do they think they'll continue?
People stop doing them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And they go back and revert back to what they would normally do, right? Or find something new, right? Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So what are people doing now that are new beyond this? What's some latest things that people are into at the moment? What are your friends into?
Watching movie.
Yeah, watching movies. Yeah. What about TikTok?
Yes, many of my friends are turning to be the creator and content creator, like on the YouTube and being a YouTuber in the YouTube.com. I don't know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. And the things like that people are doing when they've got the time to do it online, and these are the sorts of things that will pop up. My question back for you all is will they last, or do you think they'll stop?
I think
Stop.
I think stop.
Yeah. These are what's called fads, right? So they're in 1 minute or one period of time, if you like, and they're out the next. Yeah. So I enjoy it for a little while, and then maybe I get bored or move on to something else, and we stop doing it. Yeah. For whatever reason. So, today what we're talking about is things that are not related to these things, right? So these things come and go, and we get interest in them, and they drop, and everything else. What we're talking about are longer term conditioning that are really shaping the market, right? So over the COVID situation, some things will continue, like we mentioned with the aggregators of food delivery and so forth. That will continue because it's a movement that is now not just popular, but is growing in terms of the way in which you can access food. And that was expected to continue. Some things will drop and some movements will drop with inside it, but ultimately those things will continue. Other things like these, they'll just stop. Okay, so if we have a look at these more in the longer term, we've got to have a look at what's going to happen. So we talked about some of the technology enhancements. So, and I'll give you an example of all of this, but the acceleration of the e-commerce or just buying goods or services online, again, with the examples that I showed you, and I'll show you some more, this was simply an acceleration that would have occurred in 2025, but is actually happening now. So it provides a more, if you like, a broader view on the retail environment that would change. Things like the home cooking, as we mentioned, the DIY, social gatherings, trips to the mall with a family, shopping at department stores, all of these things that are mentioned will ultimately revert back. And even some elements around exercising and so forth. Some of them, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but elements around exercising, health and wellness will continue, but what you do around health and wellness will change. So maybe this year it's around exercising and running, and then maybe next year it's looking after my body in a different way. So health and wellness overall, we tend to think will continue, but how you do it will change. But all of those sorts of things. It's just behavior. And those behavioral shifts tend to revert back to normal, or what is close to normal that you live in your lives. Okay, it may not necessarily be back to what you previously did, but it would be an evolution of that. And then some of those experiences, as we mentioned, to do with the online, how we pay, the diversity and the range in which we look at online, will all continue, and we expect that to continue. Okay, so let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. I want to just explain this in a way and walk you through. But before we do it, I want to just explain some of the other impact factors that affect a market with a pandemic like this. Usually, if you have a look at the chart here, and this is just a schematic drawing of it, but what happens is usually in a pandemic, you'll see a rise and everyone gets worried, which we did, of course, last year. And we're all under work from home or whatever, and we change our behaviors, and it affects us. If it's a pandemic that's shorter in time, such as if people can remember a number of years ago, there was a pandemic in Asia called SARS. And that affected not Thailand as much. It was more Hong Kong, China, and Singapore. And it was a flu-like virus that hit for about 3 months, but ended up dissipating. But in that period of time, everyone changed their behavior, but then it reverted back to what we previously occurred. There are others that are obviously longer, and this pandemic, I can say, and everyone can read up on this, and the reality is no one in this last couple of decades have experienced anything like it. You have to go back to speak to your grandparents and so forth to revisit pandemics that have been such a significant factor on what we're experiencing here and the duration or the time. The second point about it is it also affects the economy, and the longer they go on, then the impact on the economy then is affected. And the point to pandemics is, and as this illustration explains, that the longer the behavioral impact, the bigger the economic impact, and the longer at which it takes the economy and the country itself or the region or the world to get back to where it was previously. And that's the key to it. So this is longer. It's affected our country. It's affected the economy in many, many different ways. And of course, the way in which we live our lives are obviously affected by that. So let's just have a look at the economic side, because the economic side is also the factor here. And I'll just explain a couple of points to it. One is the GDP, of course, is and has dropped, of course, last year, and the expectation around this year is not as good either. And it's going to take some time for the economy to get back. It's largely driven by all the different industry sectors. One of them, of course, is tourism, and that's a big sector for Thailand. And of course, we won't see that improve until everyone or the majority of people, based on the herd community philosophy, is we'll have to get everyone vaccinated, or the majority of people vaccinated, before that kicks in. And we won't see that occurring until that happens. So how has it affected us in other ways? The numbers underneath come from surveys that we've been running, and 56% of Thais are working normally and have the same income, and then 44% have either taken pay cuts. Furlough means they've been put off, so they haven't been working for a while, or either laid off or not working at all. So if they've got less income, and as you can see below that, in terms of current income, 63% are actually less income. It's going to affect spending. And that's a big number depending on how reduced it is. And the other side to it is the debt. So, of course, how much debt do people go into? Very, very significant. And at the moment, you've got a large number where you've got 1 in 5, 1 in 4, I should say, don't have enough money to live on and need to borrow. So that debt just gets worse. And these are the factors that are going to affect how we're spending, what we're spending on, and of course have had an impact on the economy. And again, we have to take this financial situation into account when we're looking at these longer term elements. Okay. So let's move on to these longer term trends that we're talking about. So of course, that has helped in some way shape what we're looking at in terms of the current situation. But again, when we're trying to look at trends, we're trying to remove elements that are influencing or affecting short term and looking at longer term elements. And this is just an example of the current situation where we would. But urbanization and demographic changes are two of the factors that are more longer term. Urbanization, we'll talk about. So urbanization is the migration from people from a rural to an urban way of living. It's been going on worldwide, as well as in Thailand. So the numbers up the top will give you a 20-year period. This can be extended longer if you wanted to have a look at it. But the current urban population is just over 50%. And the rural population drops 1 to 2% per year. So that may seem small year on year, but over time, there's again this longer term trend and shift to this urban environment. And it reshapes the way in which we live, not only just in terms of total Thailand, but also our lives and what we do within our lives if we're moving from this rural environment to the urban. Why do people do it? There's a number of factors around it. Economic and of course jobs are a big player in that, as well as education. So people come down to Bangkok, and in fact, if you took those who are transitory in terms of the movement, so those people who come, let's say, to Bangkok to work, that number would absolutely be much higher. And that number would be key because we're coming to work and then perhaps still living up country. Jobs, of course, are here, education, and also the prosperity, meaning the way in which we live. So things like infrastructure, we've got our communication networks, which are better, transportation is better, and just facilities around that. So anything to do with hospitals or schools, just examples from it, or even plumbing and water and sanitation are all better in that urban environment than we did in the rural. And again, this is something we expect to continue. The challenge around this, and this is a quote from John Wilmoth, who's works for the UN, and it's a big challenge because when you're actually moving from a rural to an urban environment, then the planning in which those urban areas need to account for with all those infrastructure needs to be well in advance of when people actually move, or otherwise it creates even more challenges around it. If things don't work, if there's problems with sewerage, if there's problems with connectivity, we all jump up and down if our Wi-Fi doesn't work, then of course all of those those elements are not in place, it creates problems around it. And quite clearly there is. If we have a look at some of the factors around it and what we're facing, things like pollution from the traffic congestion and so forth, day-to-day realities for how and what sort of problems we're looking at in terms of that urban environment. But that's one we continue to see, and this is not just for Thailand, it's globally, and we see it time and time again in different countries where you have this significant shift and movement in terms of our urban way of living. Okay, so in terms of demographics, we've got a number of different demographics and social change that we've seen. The first points we'd like to look at is this chart explains from 1970 this time right through to 2020. And for the first element that we looked at here was GDP. And the second one was linking this back to our urbanization. And actually, when you have a look at those numbers there for real, and you take even the urbanization, if you actually went back to 1990, and I'm sure there's many people on the call here it probably were not born in 1970, but you can see the urbanization number there. So we've moved and shifted from a 21% in 1970, and speaking to your family members, you'll get an understanding of this and what sort of environment they were living in back then, to quite clearly now is a big shift in terms of that urbanization. The other social change, which is linked to the family and the household, is the family size has changed. So back in the 1970s, families were bigger. It was almost 6 people per family size. We're now down to 3. Okay, so the number of kids born is actually lower. Okay, let's have a look at the other factors in terms of demographics. So we've got the 2 charts here, which is linked to the first one. On the right-hand side is the number of children, and on the left-hand side is the life expectancy. Okay, so it gets older. So this is in years. So what we're looking at here is Thais that are living longer, and they're having less babies. Okay, so people are living longer. They're getting older, right? And the population is not younger because there's less people born. So effectively what you're going to get as a dynamic is a much older population in Thailand. Okay, what effects do you think, and I'm going to open it up, so take your mutes up. What effects is this going to have on our social change and the demographics? What's it going to do to the population? What are we going to see? Does anyone want to have a guess? Or have they studied this and know?
The population will decrease.
Yeah, well, the population at the moment will decrease. Yeah. It won't grow at the same rate, right?
And most of the people in the social will be like the old one.
Yeah.
And
yeah, right.
The younger will be less.
Yeah. So what impact is that going to have on society? What do you think it'll happen?
I guess so. The worker are also less, and also that no one to pay a tax, which means that the government has no revenue to run the country, right?
Yeah, we've got to have a look at changes that way, right? Which are big. So let's have a look at these. So if people are going to live longer, then there's going to be longer term factors here. Okay, so here's some of them. I'll just mention some of them. But purchasing power also changes. So if people are older, then providing they got money, okay. But if they're to the point in which was just mentioned, if they haven't saved as much money up, then of course there's less people actually working. That's going to generate that. The second thing is, and it also it was mentioned in some ways, but this is also not just government, but it's also related to it. The healthcare spend is going to go up, and who's going to pay for that? Who pays for all that? Also, health and wellness priorities change. So let's say the way in which we're looking even at food preferences it will tend to change. And then more from demand level. So if we've got a lot of people who are, let's say, retired, we've got technology. So we may need to have a look at how we support them. We'll have a look at businesses, but the challenge around businesses is we may need to look at technology because we don't have enough people to in the labor market to help support this. So what about robots? Maybe we need robots to look after them. And also there is also skills for things like jobs like data scientists. If we've got all this information, and healthcare is a big player in terms of data that looks at it in different ways, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later, but there's a need for people like that that's going to help support this generation into the future. And these are big, these are monumental changes. So both of them from a demographic level and also from an urbanization level will change in the long term the whole dynamic around Thailand. Okay, big change that will occur. Okay, the third one, which we're going to cover off, and this is a big area, and I've tended to focus on it only to the point at which technology is such a broad term, and yes, it is a mega trend that is going to affect the way in which our lives live today and tomorrow. But it's more important to have a look at the implications in which the technology is playing that you may not necessarily think has changed your life, but behind what you're doing is technology related. And we'll have a look at some business cases that are more specific to this later on, but we'll have a look at technology, but it's a broad term. Yes, it's a mega trend, but it's how the technology is actually applied that is ultimately going to reshape the world and also Thailand. It's not the technology itself. Okay, so that's an important element to take away. It's not the technology itself. It's inseparable with what we do for our lives, but it is what you do with that technology, whether it's healthcare, education, what we buy or how we pay for our goods and services. That's the difference in which technology will make. Okay, and that's an important factor for it. I brought this chart up. I just want to explain this to you because a number of these factors you may be familiar with. And the point I'm bringing up about it, this is from Gartner, an IDC, and it's a conglomerate of thought leaders in terms of technology. And the reason I bring it up is it's back in 2013 that looked at the predictions of technology that are going to affect our markets in 2014. So we're now in 2021, and in fact, most of these topics are still being talked about, and it's just a progression of them over time. So this is back in 2013. Now, today, similar sorts of topics in which we're talking about. It's just the evolution of them. Okay. And the point to this is, with the technology and what we're discussing back even on all these topics that you see on the screen there, there's 3 key elements to them. And this is what we need to expect moving forward. And I'll talk specifically about all of these 3 points through the course of this section. But the first element around it is the pace of change is not linear, it's actually exponential. So what we're referring to that in a shorter term, and I'll give you this example for the shorter term and just linking it back, but a lot of this is more to do with the longer term over decades than it is on years. But if you remember what I said earlier about over COVID, and the restaurants had to react, or some restaurants in particular, but they had to react and change to food delivery in 5 weeks, not 5 years. So it accelerated that technology. It was a forced move, but that's what we're talking about with exponential. It's not a linear growth, it's an exponential growth that as soon as something takes off, it goes directly up in a big way rather than just simply linear. A lot of the technology is also data related, or the influence of data it has on it is going to have an impact on how quickly the technology is being used and adopted. And a lot of the technology requires that data behind it. So we are lucky in an industry that we're in because we see the data and the importance of it. Everyone tells you how important data is. Jack Ma, previous head of Alibaba, will always tell you the same thing. And in fact, he equated it to the new oil, he said. So data is the new oil because all of this technology business is related around data and the importance of data moving forward. And then the last point is all around, you know, efficiencies and automation and changing our lives in the way in which it'll make it easier with the way in which we do things or how we do things. And that comes through this automation process and also the digitalization of it. So they're the 3 underlying factors for how we see technology moving, and we'll see how that affects with some examples and so forth. But I'm going to take you through this and explain a little bit more. And I've been teaching on a number of these different trends, particularly to do with technology, for some time. And of course, we all try to read as much as we can. And I always revert back to this book, and it comes from PhD Media. Actually, they've put their publication out a number of years ago on a book called Merge. So I'd encourage you, if you could find it or just have a look at it online, and you can see for yourself how they've seen. And we'll explain a little bit more on this in the next slide, but how they've seen technology advancing over longer periods and how they expect this to have an impact on our lives for generations to come. And I've always reverted back to this book because it's a very good read on how they've defined it. They define the stages in terms of 5, and it groups them together. And many of these, of course, as I mentioned earlier, people weren't even born then. But you can take these as monumental shifts and stages in the lifespan from 1950s right through to 2050, and have a look at the differences there. So they've got the 5: surfacing, organization, extracting, anticipating, and elevating. The surfacing is more around, if you go and do your history on technology and have a look at even the devices that we used and how big computers were and the lack of mobility in mobile devices and so forth many years ago, back from the 1950s. All of this and the implications around it are to do with that stage. The second stage, from 1990 to 2015, was all around the organization of information and how we look at it and how we process it. The third stage, which we're currently in, is all around extracting information. So, back in the stage 2, we never had a Google. We didn't have Google back then. And if we did, it was actually, in fact, Yahoo. And even at that time, you could punch a word in and you could find out elements that were included in it. But it was by no means not the same level as what we're looking at the moment. So that extracting stage is all around being able to extract all the relevant at this point in time whenever we can. And we're going to explain a little bit more about that, and we'll explain a little bit more about that anticipating. So let's have a look at that early stage from Thailand's perspective, and I'll take you through these reasonably quickly. Okay, so it's all device related in the early stage, and we're now at a point smartphones are reasonably prevalent. What's the guess on the number of people, the percentage of people in Thailand who have a smartphone? Who wants to take a guess? Is it 20%? 99. Yeah, close. It's 80. It's 80%. So bearing in mind, if we took 99, in this we talk about the population, right? So there's probably some older people that have never had a device or don't really need it. And of course, we've got our younger kids, although the number of people who have a smartphone is getting younger and younger. I myself have been reluctant to give young kids a phone when they're too young, but it's getting younger and younger. But of course, if you took all the population out, of course that would go up if we took them out. And what about the accessing the internet? How much is done on the mobile device? How much are you accessing the mobile, the internet through the mobile? Is it a lot? How much time do you spend on it? I'd imagine it's significant. Okay, let me give it to you. 71%. So you've got most